Prime Minister from the government side.
So I'm going to clarify three bases of today's debate. First of all, what kind of peacekeeping operation are we going to talk about? Current peacekeeping operation is actually operated under the system where the country, independently, voluntarily dispatching their own countries. For example, the top three contributors of peacekeeping operations like Bangladesh, India, Pakistan. Unfortunately, those countries are not financially dominant, better than the United States or French Western country. Sorry about that. Instead of those peacekeeping operators, what kind of private military contractor are we going to support on side of the proposition? We're actually talking about, for example, Academy, Aegis Defense System, which is actually currently existing in the status quo, which is a profit-oriented institution on the purpose actually to operate the successful peacekeeping operation or the protection of innocent citizens in the status quo. And the important point here that we have to actually support on-site population is those private military contractors that suffer the lack of the human capital mistakes. At least we can guarantee the quality, the number of the soldier, the weapon. We say that we have to regard those PMC as an organized institution. Number three, the burden of proof of this population branch is they have to prove that why UN should not actually use private military contractor in its peacekeeping operation. Simple question. So based on that, I'm going to talk about mainly two issues in my speech. First of all, I'm going to talk about the nature of the peacekeeping operation, what condition is actually necessary to actually make peacekeeping operation successful. Having clarified that, second one, I'm going to talk about the comparative analysis between those PMC and the independent countries cooperation. So first we move on to the nature of the peacekeeping operations. We say peacekeeping operation cannot be achieved in 2 or 3 days. It should be based on a long-term perspective. How do you mean by this? Because even after the conflict ended in certain area, we have to arrange infrastructure. Actually, we have to train the police in the local area, or actually enhance the road, in order to facilitate the transportation in those countries. Actually, revitalize the country in the long term. That is why, Mr. Speaker, the important point here is it takes not only 2 weeks or 3 days, but it took more 5 or 10 years. We need consistent long-term project in order to actually make peacekeeping operation successful. That is why, for example, even in Japan, it took after the 1945, it took even for Japan, it took 30 years to revitalize Japan to the extent they can compete with another country in the economical level. So having clarified that, let me just move on to the second issue, the comparative analysis between PMC and those international cooperation in the status quo. So I have 3 criteria to compare those two actors. First of all, the resource which those two actors have. Second one, I'm going to talk about the time criteria, which institution can actually swiftly, urgently comply with the needs regarding the peacekeeping operation. Number 3, the criteria is the vulnerability regarding the relationship with the public opinion in those independent countries. So first criteria is about the resource. We say that as for current peacekeeping operation, we see the huge limited military resource when we actually capture the current international context to fight against every single terrorism of those countries. How do I mean by this? Because even for the United States, French, or any country, Western country, have necessity to combat with various terrorism occurring in various areas in the status quo. For example, United States already having a massive military budget to actually conduct the air bombing for the Syria, but actually French is actually sending massive their military to combat Boko Haram in the African nations, all those kind of things. Considering, recognizing those situations, we can expect that much actually, the dispatch of the military or weapon provision from those current peacekeeping operation system in the status quo. Compared to that, we say the beauty of the PMC in the status quo, because PMC is actually the have independent connection with a lot of military company, weapon company by their own. They have established their own connection throughout 150 years. That means because they are also constantly also training their soldiers, and also they're constantly presuming that various strategies actually comply with various scenarios. But that is because in terms of the resources and the quality of the institution, we say PMC simply goes superior to the case of the current peacekeeping operation. But secondly, in terms of, for example, the time which actually urgently or swiftly comply with the need of peacekeeping operation. First of all, let me talk about the current system's fault. We say that always, when countries decide to actually dispatch their military, they firstly have to pass the law in the parliament. Actually, after they convince the public opinion, they can finally dispatch the military to that area for the purpose of peacekeeping operation. But unfortunately, many countries are really sensitive to their sacrifice their own citizens in the status quo. That is why, even though maybe some country can voluntarily send their military, but it takes huge time, for example, 1 or 2 years to actually comply with the situation of peacekeeping operation, although the necessities that currently happen in the status quo. Compared to that, we say PMC goes better as well. Why? Because simply PMC is actually profit motivated. As soon as actually they found the need in the market, in the peacekeeping operations market, actually as soon as they actually step into those markets, they can get more profit. They can actually compete better with the situation of the status quo. That is why they have strong incentive to urgently actually comply with the needs of the peacekeeping operation compared to the case of the current system. But lastly, in terms of the relationship with the public opinion, we say also PMC goes better in this term. Why? Because we have to recognize country-based cooperation is always vulnerable to the public backlash, because it involves your family, your friends to be actually killed in the peacekeeping operations area or not. For example, in Somalia, when actually the movie showing U.S. Army dragged on the ground by the opposite party, that caused a strong criticism in the public sphere in the United States. They actually finally the United States succumbed to the public opinion and withdrew the military from the Somalia because they're vulnerable to the public opinion. That is why after that, Somalia could not revitalize its country's political system, economic system without any kind of cooperation and the status quo. Compared to that, we say PMC goes better. Why? Because PMC is the primary principle is actually their performance of their salary is actually proportionate to the performance they made in those peacekeeping operations, which is not actually have complete relationship with the public opinion. It is composed of various national people. So we say they're not actually. They should not always have to stick to the public opinion, and they can flexibly comply with the needs of peacekeeping operations. For all those reasons, we meant to have this proposal.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for your speech. Now I'd like to welcome Leader of Opposition.
Two things from Leader of Opposition today. First of all, how these private military corporations have less accountability and how that's extremely harmful to the basic war grounds of what's going to go on in these peacekeeping operations. Secondly, how the commercial incentives, which they seem to highlight, these things are profit-seeking seeking is going to be harmful and will lead to many harms. And lastly, we're going to cut down the whole assumption of the government, which will make all of their arguments fail. But before that, let's go on to first of all the stance of the government, and secondly the rebuttals, right? Because our stance today is what we're against is financially incentivized bodies, right? Because we think with financially incentivized bodies, that also comes other incentives for you to gain more profit, for you to get more money, and because of that, that will lead to many dirty tactics, which we do not want to agree with. But secondly, what we are also Secondly, we think that we need to stay with these peacekeeping operations because the UN needs to be able to take 100% responsibility for what is happening. They have to have 100% accountability for what is happening in their peacekeeping operations. We don't think that can be done with private military contractors. Let's go on to rebuttals, right? Two main rebuttals. First of all, their whole problem about limited military budget. If you have money to hire private military companies, you should have the money to use that for resources, right? We don't see like justification that just because you have no resources, suddenly you can go and turn to things like academy, which mind you has cost you a lot of money, has cost the United States a lot of money, and we think that there's a problem, right? Secondly, speed, right? We concede the fact that sometimes the PKO can be like slow. It cannot be like the fastest and most efficient, but we think that that's a good thing, right? Because we don't think that a swift decision always equals a good decision. We think that slowness is necessary to evaluate whether or not it's necessary for you to go into these places and whether or not you should invade these places, right? We don't think that just because speed is 100% good, that this is suddenly a good proposal to take. Let's go on to the model coming from opposition side today, right? Because what we want to do is, first of all, we want to keep these peacekeeping operations, but we also want to cooperate with regional military bodies, right? What are we talking about? We're talking about the SADC, we're talking about the African Union, the AU, NATO, ECOWAS, and things like that. What's different between what's mutually exclusive between private military contractors and these regional bodies is that these regional bodies aren't profit-seeking. They don't know money, right? We have a problem with these private military contractors being profit-seeking, and we'll tell you why in my speech. Let's go on to less accountability, right? We know that there's two main reasons why these PKCs are not, private military contractors do not have less accountability. First of all, if you are a private military contractor, you can't be prosecuted in, for example, the international jurisprudence or in the law, right? Meaning that even if you commit lots of crimes against humanity, even if you commit tons of war crimes, because you are an average citizen, because private military contractors are of the average citizen, you can't be prosecuted. Meaning that this justifies these private military contractors to use torture, to use inhumane killings and unnecessary killings of innocent civilians with no harm whatsoever, which leaves no deterrence for them to not use this, right? Let's take an example. We think that, for example, when the Iraqi war, when America used Blackwater, there was tons of human rights violations due to the fact, and no one can prosecute them afterwards, due to the fact that it was a private military contractor. We have a big problem with that because we do not want human rights violations, and we don't think that's proper war. Secondly, we think that there's no transparency of war due to this. You can't see what's going on, right? Because of the fact that private military contractors are citizens, you can't count the number of deaths. You can't count the number of casualties. You can't know how bad that war is. Why is that harmful? Because these facts being crucial to the public, these facts need to be public and available in order for citizens to calculate whether or not these wars are necessary, to calculate whether or not these peacekeeping operations are justified or not, and whether or not they're good. We think that the private military contractors also, being a profit-seeking institution, they have no incentive to show these things to the public, right? We think that's very, very harmful because transparency is necessary to fight better wars, to have better peacekeeping operations. Let's go on to the second point of the commercial incentives.
Alright, so all of those things can be solved because the moment the PMC wears the blue helmet, they're accountable to the UN itself. We can put new places, we can put new laws in place. What is the explicit necessity of explicitly banning
that doesn't make
operations
sense,
like
right?
PMCs?
Because private military contractors, when they worked for the U.S. Army, didn't wear U.S. hats. They were never for the U.S., right? They worked as Blackwater. They worked as Academy. They don't work as UN. That logic makes no sense. It's a logical fallacy right there, right? Let's go on to the second point about the commercial incentives to gain profit. We have two main problems, actually three main problems, sorry. First of all, we think that due to the fact that they conceded that these things are long-term services and they take a lot of time, that means that these people will have an incentive to prolong the conflicts, right? Why? Because if you prolong the conflicts, the more and more you go on, the more and more money you get, the more and more profit you get, meaning that you get more and more profit need to have wars prolonged. They lobby groups, they lobby governments to have wars prolonged. For example, the Iraqi war, in order to have more profits, in order to have that demand is so crucial for them to get money and to sustain their companies, right? We think that furthermore, what this will lead to, in the same manner, is the industrial lobbying of these, for example, private military contractors to prolong wars, to cause wars. And we think that's very harmful because we don't want any wars that are unnecessary, that are not crucial, right? Secondly, due to the fact that they consider the fact that salary is proportional to what we do, we think this will radicalize military people. These will radicalize people within these private military contractors. What does that mean? Like, why is that? It's because you are only counted for what you succeed in with these private military contractors. The more terrorists you kill, the more people you kill, the more money you get, the more bonuses you get, the higher your salary is, right? Because of that, if, for example, you are like a private military contractor, and there's a building with a terrorist in it, with like thousands of innocent civilians, you're still going to bomb that building because you get a higher salary, right? We think that with, for example, the UN, because they have credibility, because they can be persecuted in the war, for war crimes, that doesn't happen, right? We are not okay with that radicalization and the killing of many people. But lastly, the assumption of government side is the fact that there's free trade in these private military contractors. Not true, right? It's already a monopoly. First of all, there's a limited number of military corporations. Blackwater, Executive Outcome, Academy, there's only so much that they have, and because they already have tons of money and tons of connections and social capital, there's like lots of people can't access. But it's going to be worse in the aftermath because they're going to get more and more money, making sure that more and more private military contractors can come in. We think that's harmful because there's no check and balance system. Furthermore, this will lead to more monopolistic nature. We're not okay with that. At the end of the day, private military contractors have done no good. They've done tons of harm. We win.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, for your remarks. Now I would like to call upon the Leader of Government.
The inherent problem with the case run by the opposition is that they didn't attack equality of PMCs. They attack the failure that regards how you deploy PMCs, how you utilize PMCs based on the idea of accountability. We think that we can stop that kind of thing happening. We're going to show you why. We're also going to talk to you about why this makes PMCs more accountable, but before that, many pieces of rebuttal to the idea of opposition. Now, opposition tells you that we can't make these people accountable because they work under Blackwater. Fine, we hire Blackwater as the UN, we make them put on blue helmets, we make them obey the Geneva Convention and the Hague Conventions and all those kind of war criminal treaties that are associated with them, and we think that if you do that, that will probably work, right? Because look what they say. They say they will abuse the system. There's an incentive to create war, there's an incentive to kill people. No, because that's how badly the contract is written under your side. If we don't make these people based on like performance measures, based on how many you kill people, but maybe how many people you saved, how many people you managed to give, how quickly you managed to have fair elections in this country, then maybe they'll be incentivized to perform those measures, rather than blow people up in buildings, like what they say on opposition. So we think that that's the problem of your side, assuming that contracts are going to be drawn up really, really, really badly, ladies and gentlemen. And also, notice, Mr. Speaker, if a person performs so badly at their job, their contract will be terminated. G4S Securities will not be able to apply for a UN post again because they know they have performed very badly. And we will now use Academy, or we will now use Aegis Defense, or we will now use Executive Outcomes, or whatever PMC services are still out there. And they say this is a monopoly. It's a monopoly now because only the US hires these people. If the UN hires these people, presumably there will be more companies out there because there are ex-military officials all the time, and these people will be making their own private military companies. Like what the other guy did in Syria before he got captured, right? So presumably, these people will be able to solve the problems that they talked about. Now, accountability. Now, let's take a look at this one. The reason why these people aren't accountable is because The reason why these people aren't accountable is because there is no international law governing the status of mercenaries in the current situation. Mercenaries are excluded from the Geneva Convention. Mercenaries are excluded from the Hague Convention. And therefore, there is nothing to do with them. They're treated like terrorists, basically. They can do anything, and they can have something, anything done to them. That's a legal loophole that we would like to see fixed on our side of the house, where we see the UN deploy peacekeepers. For example, if they commit acts of atrocity, like using dum-dum bullets inside Yugoslavia, then we're happy to prosecute those people on our side of the house. I'll tell you who we can't prosecute in the status quo, though. US military personnel who commit acts of humanity and kill innocent citizens inside Iraq, because the US government has a vested interest in seeing their soldiers safe. That's why the US government actively protects its military when they go into Iraq, so the Iraqi court cannot try them. But if there is not so much incentive for you to try them like that, then as you have with PMCs, then you can actually try them inside Iraq. And that's a lot better than by having the US court martial them, because it's more transparent to the citizens of Iraq and not just the US military in general. So actually, you get more accountability because the fact that they are now distancing themselves from the state and national interests and the incentive to protect their citizens means that there is more incentive and more increased participation on behalf of the countries that they are being deployed to. The Iraqi government will probably like to try the PMC soldiers and the US soldiers who killed innocent citizens in Iraq. They can't try the US soldiers because they've just been deployed back. But they can try the PMC soldiers because they are now accountable and they are a private citizen and therefore can be tried. It's a beautiful model, ladies and gentlemen. Then, look, the idea about continued momentum, right? Because they never responded to this point. They said that this is going to create intransparent costs. Easy, we're happy to make it transparent. Presumably the United Nations has an auditing agency, presumably they have a statistics office, and presumably they publish very good data on the behalf of the UN. We're happy to use that to make them see casualties. And again, here is the problem. When the United States or other citizens see casualties, see their own citizens being beheaded on national television, they want to bring the United States forces back home. They want to bring the French forces back home. But that is precisely the problem, because we've told you that a continued momentum and the continued existence of peacekeeping operation forces is necessary to ensure long-term stability. The reason why UNISOM II failed in 1993 is because the United States backed out of the peacekeeping operations after Black Hawk Down and after seeing their soldiers burned and hung in Mogadishu. If you don't have that same amount of vested interest, you can actually keep people there. And I'll tell you another thing, 75,000 PMC officials are still inside Iraq, even though the United States forces have withdrawn. Because, ladies and gentlemen, there is not much interest in the lives of the PMC citizens. It's unfortunate, but we think it's preferable to not having anybody there and, we're seeing another Somalia, ladies and gentlemen. Number 3, the idea about, speed. Because they got this all wrong, right? We agree that whatever situation happens, we need UN authority. We agree with that, okay? The UN Article 7 and UN Article 8 of the UN Charter, we agree with that concept. What we don't agree, though, is that these UN demands have to pass through domestic legislation in terms of PKOs. So the UN might say do this right now, but the United States might take 5 months deliberating on that, and that 5 months is crucial. It's said that if the French forces... I took it now.
So are you okay with the use of bounty hunters and drone under your justification?
If the PMCs can buy them, then yes, because we can create the same laws for them to make them just as accountable as any other forces in the world, right? We're not okay with war criminals, we are okay with technology that helps to keep soldiers safe. It's only natural. Right. Now, the ideas. So if the French forces had entered Rwanda 3 months earlier than they did in the case of Rwandan genocide, 6,000 more Rwandans could have been saved. That's statistically proven on our side. You don't have that when you have domestic legislature not looking at national interest and arguing about the pros and cons. The moment when you have UN authority is the moment when these private military contractors can enter and be deployed into peacekeeping operations areas to ensure maximum stability. Now, We've told you that these people become more accountable and they are highly trained, right? They're usually more stronger than the forces that are left to oppose them. Executive outcomes actually managed to defeat RUF forces in Freetown and then drive them back in Sierra Leone in the 1990s. We think that these people are highly capable of trying to deliver the peace and stability that is necessary to the nation. Ladies and gentlemen, we've told you the model for structural problems of the state, the involvement of the state in peacekeeping operations, which are transnational and international in nature. We've told you that their harms are not exclusive harms, because they happen under the state model as well, and we can create laws to circumvent those, and we're very happy to propose.
Okay, thank you, Member of Government, for your speech. Now I do welcome Member of Opposition.
Thank you, Madam Chair. 3 issues in my speech. First issue, is there a necessity to take this policy? Now, what we hear from the affirmative is twofold. First of all, they talked about how in conflict zone, in order to sustain reconstruction, they need a sustainable flow of military forces. And they talked about how PMC is better than United Nations PKO right now in order to fund the continuity of that force. And they talked about how, in the status quo, PKO oftentimes back down from certain conflicts, for example, in the case of Somalia. Now, what we say is that in sometimes it is better to back down from certain conflicts. It is important for us to retreat from certain conflicts because the existence of those PKO, existence of military force in that country is actually causing more harm than benefit. The important point in the status quo, the important point that we have to make in the status quo is that in the status quo there are a democratic process in which civilians, diplomats, and every actors in the international sphere can check whether the conflicts in that situation in that conflict zone is worse. Sending these PKOs and military forces to that particular country. The problem with their case is that it severely decreases the incentive of various actors, civilians or diplomats or any actors in the international community to severely check on whether the conflict zone is worth fighting for, because now they're simply funding a mercenary and there's no direct humanitarian casualty cost to them. There's not any political cost to them for the discontinuity of that war. Sit down. The second problem they talked about was in terms of speed. When conflicts happen, it is important for us to intervene very quickly. Now, first of all, as my partner already mentioned, speed is not always the correct answer. It is sometimes better for us to be precautious and make sure that we want to intervene in the correct conflict and not intervene in the wrong conflict. But even if that was the case, we don't think that this policy will significantly alter and solve the problem of speed. Because here's how PKO works right now. Countries provide their military force to the United Nations as a PKO. And as a consequence of that, the United Nations decides whether to dispatch that PKO to a particular conflict or not. Now, but here's the problem. There's not a severe problem of speed in terms of that particular country, such as India or Pakistan, providing military to the United Nations. So there's not a very big discontinuity of war there. So the reason why there's a lack of speed right now is not the problem of India not providing military to the UN. The problem of speed, which exists right now, sit down, is the problem of UN inherently. Whether the United Nations or the Security Council will decide to send that PKO to a particular conflict zone. That is where most speed is taken in the status quo. And frankly, their policy does absolutely nothing to solve that. Because even in their policy, the United Nations Security Council will probably have to spend a lot of time on whether to dispatch the PKO to that particular conflict zone. So the point is, their policy does absolutely nothing to solve the problem of speed. Sit down. Second issue. Can we really control private military contractor? Because what we hear from the affirmative is that when the United Nations purchase and have contract with these PMCs, these PMC comes under the control and the regulation of the United Nations, and therefore we're not going to have crazy PMC. Sit down. First of all, that is empirically not true. When we see incidents such as the Blackwater in Iraq, just because you are subscribed to a particular country, such as the United States, even at that, Blackwater can cause many incidents. But second of all, the United Nations has actually less incentive to be accountable if we take this policy. Because now we can, even if an incident happened, even if a private military contractor and some soldier conducts a massive incident killing innocent victims or like tortures and rape civilians, the United Nations can simply blame the PMC. They don't have to take their own responsibility and be accountable for that. They could simply demand people to sue the PMC. We think that makes UN less accountable to the incident. Sit down. Thirdly, we say that even if accountability somehow works with their magical blue hat, like we don't think that this will like necessarily destroy the unique necessity of using PMC in the first place. Like if this private military contractor is so subscribed to the laws and restriction of the international law and the regulation of the United Nations, then what's the difference between PMC and using other military forces such as cooperating with NATO, or like other SADC and those kind of forces? There's no unique necessity or benefit of using PMCs. Sit down. But fourthly, what we say is that in the status quo, the situation is more accountable because international community and various actors in the international community have an active incentive to check whether the conflict is worth fighting for, ladies and gentlemen. For example, when the Japanese government decides to send its military troop or self-defense force sit down to assist the PKO in Iraq and other various conflict zones in Africa, they have an active incentive in the Diet to discuss whether that conflict zone is worth fighting for and whether the PKO activity has legitimacy and there's no active torture or incidents going on in that particular country in the Diet. Not yet. What we say is that in the Active Plan Adoption, there's less incentive for Japanese people to make sure that PKO operation happening in Afghanistan or Africa is legitimate and there's less incident because the United Nations is purchasing this military operation, PMC, and as a consequence of that, there's a sense of self-responsibility. Like even if these soldiers die over there in Africa, that has less like moral implication to the Japanese people. If Japanese people or Japanese self-defense force are dying there, that has more moral concerns and more incentive for Japanese people to check. That is why check and accountability was not going to work after Plan Adoption. Yes?
You're right, there should be discussion on whether entering a conflict zone or exiting a conflict zone is worth it. But don't you think that should be done within the UN by discussing the benefits and the harms, rather than in the US because one of their Marines died?
Well, yes, it does happen in the UN under our paradigm as well, so I don't really understand your point of information. Now let's move on to my final substantive. Why this policy undermines the United Nations' ability to deal with conflicts and war. Now, regardless of how PMC is going to be after we take this policy,